Welcome, everybody. Simon Rosenberg from Hopium Chronicles. We're back now on with what's going to be a great conversation with a dear old friend, David Leopold, who's one of the leading immigration attorneys in the United States. He's been a major, important player in the policy debate around immigration now going back decades. He and I have also collaborated. We wrote a piece together that I'll be sharing in this, and when I release this on the MSNBC site 10 years ago. David, it's hard to believe, but welcome. Thank you for being with us here today.
Good to be with you. Yeah, 10 years ago, you'd think the battle would have been over by now, but here we are.
Here we are, having actually lost
Yeah, very
terrain.
much so.
We've lost terrain, right? We're further away from the mission, from winning than we were before. Listen, we're in day 4, day 5 of Trump, the sequel, as I call it. Obviously border enforcement, immigration, interior, terrorizing immigrants in the interior of the country, disrupting the labor market in the United States, all the things. This is very central. Trump himself has said this is the reason he believes he won the election. It wasn't inflation. What is happening and what should we expect?
Well, what's happening is I don't know any other way to put it, but a brutal show of force, a draconian show of force. And it isn't just, let's be really clear, it's not just in we saw what happened in New Jersey and the food service industry and elsewhere. It's everywhere. I've had conversations, emergency phone calls with major healthcare institutions, plural, about can ICE come into the hospital? Can they go into the ER? What about women who are undocumented who need to give birth? We don't want them to be giving birth at home. This is what's happening. So the terror and the fear is pervasive because of all of this.
Can we spend a minute talking about what we used to call attrition through enforcement?
Mm-hmm.
And, we had another name for it. It was self-deportation, right? Can you talk, there's going to be an element, and since you've raised this, the fear factor,
Mm-hmm.
can you talk a little bit about, the historic understanding of them about the fear, self-deportation, attrition through enforcement, and how central this is going to be? Because the truth is, deporting 11 million people would cost hundreds of billions of dollars and would be an ugly thing. And what they really want, right, what part of their central strategy is to scare everybody as much as possible so people self-deport or don't come, right? I mean, so talk a little bit about, that aspect of this, David.
Yeah, that's good. There's a good question. There's really two aspects to it. But on the self-deportation part of it, I could be wrong, but my memory is that this was something that Mitt Romney talked about in the 2012 election, that we didn't have to use all these resources because people would self-deport. He got that from I believe, nativist groups like FAIR.
Yeah, the same guys who are running the administration now.
Right. People who are now in charge of ICE.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's where he got that from. And so it preceded him. He just picked up on it. Didn't help him in that election. But basically what it is you make life so miserable, so horrible for people whose status is not documented in the United States, that they leave, that they self-deport. And I don't think it's a proven theory. My sense is it's probably not going to work. I think what it does is it forces people to simply go underground and to work in the shadows, and makes them vulnerable to employers who want to exploit them, by the way, like Mr. Trump did in his golf courses when he exploited undocumented workers. And it just makes the problem worse. Yeah, there are people who will depart. Of course, we saw that, but I don't know that it's going to be in the numbers that they are hoping. I think the other thing people should think about is this. They talk about mass deportation, and they spin it, and it is spin about going after criminals. We're going to deport violent criminals. And I think I think the reality is that I don't think that's so much spin. What they're really going to do is this. You've got hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people under what we call administrative orders of removal. Why? Because either they didn't get their notice of hearing because the system is so screwed up The Democrats tried to reform it in about 2013. The Republicans wouldn't even hear that bill in the House. That bill had funding for the immigration courts. So these immigration courts are underfunded. People don't get notice of hearings. If you don't show up at a hearing, you're ordered deported in absentia. So there's plenty of people with these orders. So what they do is they start calling these people in. They send out very sort of sterile notices. Please come in on January 15th or January 25th. We'd like to discuss your status. When they show up, they either ankle bracelet them or they lock them up and ship them because they don't need to go to a judge. They've got the final order of removal in their hand. And that's what I refer to as the low-hanging fruit. These are the people who are trying to comply with the law. Actually, the criminals, they're the ones who aren't going to show up. They're the ones who are going to run away. So it actually, the effect of this whole, strategy is the opposite. You get rid of the people who are working and the people who are trying to raise families and the people who are stymied by a system that doesn't work.
So today, for example, the White House released an image of about 12 guys in handcuffs, by the way. I mean, this is a new thing, right?
Yeah.
To make them look like they're hardened criminals, leading into the back of a military plane. It was only 12 or 14, right? It wasn't hundreds. And, to use the resources of our military to do this, and God knows where they were flying them to, right? Because now they're going to have to land in a military base, right? They can't land at a commercial airport. But can you, what you're saying, and I think this is really important, is those 12 people we saw today, the backs of them, are likely people that had these administrative orders against them. They called them in or they went to various places where they knew they were because they know who they are, right? And they rounded them up and put handcuffs on them and they frog marched them right to the plane. And so your argument here or your insight is that there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these folks that they're going to be able to sort of quickly in a distributed way start rounding up and just doing these frog marches and getting them and we're going to be seeing images like this for weeks and weeks and weeks.
Yeah, that's their big show of force. And who knows who those people were? It's if you walk into ICE, the way ICE works is they remove people through a sub-agency called Enforcement and Removal Operations. And those little agencies are, in towns all across the country. If you walk in, I guarantee you, if you walk into an enforcement and removal operations office now, it's going to be filled typically with women and their kids who are, they're probably, playing with toys on the floor with ankle bracelets. Those are the people who are going to, by and large, be deported. They're not the ones they're going to show you on TV, right? Because that's kind of horrifying. They don't look dangerous. They aren't dangerous. They're somebody's mom. And I think what the American people, Simon, bought into when they elected Trump in November was this idea of border security. They want a secure border. They want safe streets. What I think is going to be a big surprise, and that goes to what you just talked about, is that this isn't about a criminal, this isn't about them, the dangerous criminals and the security risks. This is an actuality on the ground. This is about your doctor. This is about the woman that takes care of your grandmother in the assisted living home. This is about the people who are working in the meatpacking plants, in central Ohio, or working in the agricultural fields in Nebraska and places like that. This is about them. What Trump referred to himself during the pandemic as essential workers. Remember, he kept those factories open. There were orders that they had to work. These were mostly undocumented or large part undocumented people. Then they were essential workers. These are the people who are going to suffer the most at the beginning. But you said something about economics, and it's going to wreak havoc on the price of the price of fruit, the price of vegetables, our foodstuffs in the markets. This is, I think, going to be a big surprise to the American people, especially those that voted for Trump for the reasons he, talked about, border security and crime.
Well, and it's going to raise the prices of childcare. It's going to raise the
Yeah,
price of your healthcare. It's going to raise the price of I mean, worker shortages is a cascading economic event across the entire country.
yeah,
If we remove, and if you, David, can you explain about TPS and about how we just learned, right, that there's, I think, is it 1.2 million people who are granted TPS that they're going to, I don't know how quickly they're going to be able to do it legally, but they're going to revoke the TPS status of another 1 to 1.2 million
yeah,
workers to add, and those are not people that are falling in that category that you described, right? This is a whole set of other people of about a million to million two. Can you talk about that piece as well?
yeah,
So
sure.
let's assume that the removal notices that you're describing are,
Mhm.
let's say, 500,000 to a million people, right? The low hanging fruit, the moms, and so on, that they know where they are. They're just going to go get them, and that in many cases local law enforcement will work with them to do that, right? This is not, and because it's a list, it's a known person. Then there's the next category that they seem to be targeting is this TPS stuff. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's sure, certainly. The TPS is what we call temporary protected status. Now, it's not the result of an executive order. It's not the result of the whim of some president. It's in the statute. It was passed by Congress. It is the law of the land, passed by Congress many Congresses ago, and it's been the law of the land for a long time. What is it? It allows the Department of Homeland Security, the government at its discretion to offer a temporary protected status when a country is in turmoil. So let's take Lebanon, for example. Lebanon just underwent a war. The Lebanese people were given temporary protected status for those who were here on the day that the status was issued. So that way it doesn't attract more people. Some of the countries in Central America have suffered earthquakes. Other countries have, Ukraine, for example, is another example where temporary protected status was appropriate. So there are people in the country who are under temporary protection. It gives them the right to work. It doesn't give them a green card and it doesn't give them citizenship, but it gives them the temporary right to work. And there are very strict protocols that the Department of Homeland Security, the government has to go through to revoke TPS. They have to give reasons, you know, factual reasons based on on what's going on in that country. So, for example, if they're going to revoke temporary protected status for Ukraine, they're going to have to give reasons as to why it's safe now, as opposed to when they offered the temporary protected status. That's why it makes it harder for them to revoke it. And last time around, they did try to revoke TPS. They got sued. Federal judges shut it down or slowed it down appropriately in a lot of cases because they just didn't come up with appropriate reasoning. So we'll see how that plays out in the courts. We're going to see legal challenges, but what they're doing, Simon, the upshot of what I think you're asking me, what they're doing is they're taking people who are lawfully in the United States, comply with the law. You can't get temporary status, protected status, if you have any kind of criminal history, really, a serious criminal history. They're now making them undocumented. They know where they are because they have their information in the system. More low-hanging fruit, more people who are they're going to remove. These are not violent criminals. If they were, they wouldn't have temporary protected status, and they're certainly not security risks. Again, they're vetted. So the illusion of deporting criminals is so obvious if people take a minute and think about it. They're going after another category of folks who are here absolutely legally under the law.
Well, and I think it's important for people to realize that deporting criminals first has actually been the policy of the Democratic Party. And it's actually been a policy that Republicans have opposed.
Yes, that's
Because,
exactly right.
yeah, right. So the irony or the cynicism of this moment that we're in, where Republicans are making this rhetorical argument, they're going after criminals. Well, that's what we did. And when David and I spent a lot of time working together during the Obama administration, they actually, the central reason we did not pass immigration reform in 2013 and 2014, even though the Senate passed a bill with Marco Rubio's and other people's help, the House Republicans argued that the reason they could not support it was because we wanted to deport criminals first, as opposed to deport everybody. So the logic for why we did not have a bipartisan, thoughtful, serious immigration bill that would have modernized our immigration system, done a lot to deal with these backlogs and things that David was talking about earlier, was the Republicans' argument was that prosecutorial discretion, as it's called, where you could deport criminals first, was illegitimate, and that Democrats were using this tool of prosecutorial discretion by prioritizing criminals in a way that was actually off mission. And the mission was to get rid of everybody. So historically, the Republican Party has been against deporting criminals first. And when we've come into office, we've prioritized the removal of criminals, right? And that's why this whole thing is so unbelievable, because what they claim they're doing is they're claiming to be removing criminals first. And as David explained, that's actually not what's happening, right? And they're using it as a fig leaf because they've polled on this and they realize that removing those women with children and so on doesn't poll well. It's not what anybody wants. And so they're now lining up. We're now talking about what could be millions of people who are here working in the United States in a time when we already have labor shortages, when we have historically low unemployment in the United States, which will drive up this is going to be part of Trump's agenda to drive up costs for everyday people in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, David, I want to go to one other thing that I think is really important for people to understand is in New Jersey, in a raid that happened yesterday that's been reported in Newark, when they went into whatever place they went in, they detained people that were citizens.
Yes, they did.
And even though those citizens, when ICE came in, showed identification, right? Can you talk a little bit about, and because this is something that a lot of people don't think about, right? How many of you who are watching right now, if ICE came up to you right now, would you have the ability to prove with documentation on your body that you were a citizen in the United States, that you were legitimately here? Because almost none of the identification that we have as Americans actually convey that, right? And so talk about what's going to happen now with how when these raids happen, which is why we moved away from raids, right? Because in the past, when we did these kind of workplace raids, American citizens got caught up in them, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And in many cases, those citizens couldn't at the time prove their citizenship status because our identification system doesn't have that. And then we have examples of American citizens being detained for months by ICE until they were able to somehow prove the fact that they were legally here. And can you talk a little bit about what's going to happen in this workplace raid-based system they're implementing? What's going to happen to, like this guy yesterday who was a veteran of the United States and had been a soldier for America?
Yeah, the word is chaos, and I think we saw the beginning of it yesterday when you're detaining people, and you're right, there's no way to verify on the spot whether somebody's a citizen, and it can take a long time, it can take months. And until that happens, somebody has to sit in lockup. And I think if this kind of raid-based system is implemented throughout the United States, we're going to see a lot more of that. I think we're also going to see situations where American citizens get injured, perhaps even worse. And it's a sloppy is a terrible word because it's an overly aggressive and it's a way to do things, and it's terrible law enforcement because there's other ways to do things. I think Obama, and you know this, when they saw the problems of raids and what would happen with you detaining American citizens and making mistakes, and in some cases even deporting American citizens,
Yep.
even deporting them to dangerous places. They went to what used to call silent raids. Those were paper raids where they would send in a subpoena, show us your documents, your I-9s, which are the employment verification documents to show somebody is eligible to work. All employers have to do that. When people start working, you have to show you're eligible to work in the US. And there can be tremendous sanctions against employers who don't do that. So the Obama administration went to the paper raid, which was just as effective. Probably even more so, because if there's no raid coming or rumored, people are going to go to work and they're not going to hide. So it's a much more effective way to enforce the law. This is, they called it shock and awe, it's shock and horror. It's an unbelievable way to run an immigration enforcement system because you are putting U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, at risk. And I think it also, if I might sum when we talk about U.S. citizens in the crosshairs, I think it's deliberate. I do. I think it's deliberate. I could be the only one who says this, but you've got a situation where they went after birthright citizenship, right? That got locked down. That got enjoined temporarily by a court, judge in pretty blistering language. I mean, you don't see the bench using language like that. Blatantly unconstitutional. And where were the lawyers when you wrote this? I mean, that's pretty serious stuff. That's serious stuff coming from the bench. So the judge saw that, but then they've also Stephen Miller, who is the true immigration policy person for Trump, and he's been around for decades and working with Trump since last administration. He has been fantasizing about going after people with citizenship in what we call denaturalization cases, where they come to somebody and they say, you got your citizenship, but you didn't get it legally. So we're gonna sue you in the federal court and take it away. That's a step that's coming. And I think a lot of this puts question marks next to people's citizenship. It's an attack. I fear it's an attack ultimately on U.S. citizens as well. And where that goes, I guess, is anybody's guess. But back to your specific point, these raids, if they continue, are horrific. And it's not just, this was, I believe, a fish packing plant or something like that in New Jersey. There's hospitals, there's schools, there's locations where you have people that go for healthcare, for education, that are considered religion. People go to church, synagogue, mosque, elsewhere. These places are no longer off limits. They were never really off limits, but they were considered sensitive, so they had to get special approval from the headquarters. Now they're not. They can just go in. That's going to keep people from going to the hospital. If you're worried about somebody questioning your citizenship and you're a woman about to give birth, you're going to have a choice. Do you go to the hospital or do you give birth at home? It's a healthcare. It becomes a huge healthcare issue. And that's just giving birth. What about other elements? The same with education. So it creates a police state mentality that I don't think people in this country are used to.
Well, and I think what people should realize is that historically in the law, the Supreme Court has walled off or created a distinction that basically, as a country, we needed to provide both education for undocumented kids and access to healthcare. That as a test of our humanity, right?
Mhm.
And that we couldn't put we couldn't create a circumstance where kids are in the United States and not going to school, or that a pregnant woman was about to give birth but didn't feel safe going to the hospital. That was outside of our humanity, right? That it was just too egregious. And one of the first things they've done this week is they've eliminated the sensitive place policy, meaning now that they can go to schools and they can go to hospitals, meaning that we're now going to start to see an increase of kids who are just going to stay home and
Yeah.
not go to school and not get educated. We're going to see an increase, as David pointed out, of people not going to the hospital or going to the doctor, right, when they're sick, accelerating a healthcare crisis in the United States. And I think that one of the things that everyone should realize about David, I know we're going to get to time here, but I want to just end with this. I want to go back to this idea that the way that we convey identification in America does not convey your citizenship status. That there's actually, by design, right, the way that we have and we have a very kind of a theory of identification and authentication that is very unusual, that it's not a state ID, it's not a national ID. We don't have a national identification for reasons that were really sort of the paranoid right in the United States never would allow there to be any kind of national identification of some kind. And what that means is that all of you who are watching this, if you're in a place where a raid happens and you've happened to be physically there in a hospital, in a school, whatever, even if you're an American citizen, you're multi-generational, like JD Vance's wife, right? Whose parents, she was born in the United States, her parents are immigrants. If there's a raid and she's there and she gets detained and brought to an ICE facility, her identification does not in any way convey that she's a citizen or not a citizen. There is no thing that we carry on us, any of us, right, that will allow you to be let go. And particularly for the states that have driver's licenses, right, that don't have any citizenship information on it. So then you have to then prove to them that you are legitimately here. And what everyone has to start thinking about is what happens if that's you? Do we have to all start carrying our passports for those that have passports? A majority of Americans don't have passports, right? And this is why these workplace raids and these physical location-based raids are so pernicious and malevolent because you as an American citizen have no capacity to prove on the spot that you're actually legitimately here. And what's going to happen, and my view about this is that this is an important understanding about, I think, one of the pieces of our immigration law that's been confusing to people, which is why do we have a basic assumption that if you show up at a port of entry, if you make an asylum claim, that you are allowed to go through a process of adjudication, that you have to go into a court system. The reason the court system is so critical is that it's a break against Trump deporting citizens, right? Not undocumented, not people who are not here legitimately. But if there is not a requirement for adjudication in the immigration system, it means that Donald Trump could raid the DNC and to start deporting Americans based on with no break if there isn't a requirement for adjudication, for denaturalization, so by then starving the courts of money, right, which is what's happened, we have made the whole immigration system collapse and in the United States and become dysfunctional and create the mess that David was describing. And I think that one of the things, David, I have found in my own conversations with people over the years is this sort of frustration that what do you mean someone shows up at a port of entry, 17 years old, and they get a court date 5 years from now? But the reason there is a requirement for adjudication is, in addition to all the other reasons, is that it's a break against a tyranny and the ability of a president. And I think that one of the things that's going to get tested here, and I'm agreeing with where David was going with this, which is they're going to push the envelope as hard as they possibly can on naturalized Americans who were born in other countries. And there's going to be an incredible effort around denaturalization and again, self-deportation, right? Around the idea that, and a friend of mine I spoke to the other day was born outside the United States, came here when she was 2 years old, speaks without an accent. You would never know that she was not born in America. And she said to me privately, like, I'm now for the first time terrified that somehow in the next few years, I've got 2 grown kids here in the United States. I've got a husband who's long been here. I've been a citizen of the United States, since I was a child, that I could somehow lose my citizenship and be deported. And so this is where this is all headed, right? Like David is right about this because of the way that we have the way that we authenticate ourselves as citizens is so vague. They can exploit that to create layers of intimidation and fear way beyond the target universe that they're going after, particularly because many undocumented immigrants lived in what's called mixed status households. And can you talk about that, David, for a little bit?
Yeah, I mean,
this is really important, everybody.
Yeah, most people think, the way the media tends to portray it, and certainly the way that the Republicans portray it, is that you have quote unquote families of undocumented, or what they would refer to as illegal aliens and that sort of thing. The reality is very different. The reality, Simon, as you rightly point out, is typically in a family, you'll have one person who's undocumented. So it might be an undocumented husband and the wife's an American citizen or a green card holder, and the kids are all citizens because they were born here. So you have one person, or you may have two, or you may have a grandparent. So typically it's only one person in the family who's undocumented. So when Simon, when you refer to mixed status families, you're referring to most of the families. And think about it, if you've been here a long period of time, there's going to be people in your family, in your immediate family, of course, that are U.S. citizens. And what's to stop the sweep? And I think it was Tom Homan, who's now the immigration czar, so to speak. That's what they call him. I think he said over the summer that we may end up deporting children. They can go with their parents. The children can leave.
Citizen children.
Thank you. Yes. U.S. citizen children. That is an outrageous statement. I mean, it's an absolutely outrageous statement that should never be made by any American official ever. Talking about U.S. citizens, I don't care. That's the end of it. They're a U.S. citizen. They have the right to be here, period, end of story. And for somebody like Homan or somebody else in that administration, whether it's Stephen Miller or the president himself, to talk about deporting a U.S. citizen child or parent or whatever, whomever, because it's convenient to their method of enforcement is absolutely beyond outrageous. Shouldn't be tolerated.
David, last point, and then I'll let you go, is that I think there's also a huge misunderstanding about the relationship of undocumented immigrants and the welfare system in the United States. And what people don't realize is that the only things that if you're an undocumented immigrant that you had access to was you had access to a hospital if you were a doctor, if you were sick, and you had the ability to send your kids to school. But that's it. There is no undocumented immigrants have no access to any of our social welfare programs. And this idea of the undocumented community being here and drawing resources, right, from regular Americans. The truth is, the Hispanic community is the highest worker participation rate of any demographic in the United States because undocumented immigrants have to work or they can't stay. And because they have no social safety net, they don't have access to unemployment insurance or welfare. Many undocumented immigrants pay into Social Security and Medicare their entire lives and have no ability to go get that back on the other end, right? Because they aren't, it's a false identity they're using. So can you, just as your last point, can you talk a little bit about the sort of myth of the undocumented immigrant sitting around just stealing money from hardworking Americans? Because this is also very central to the story that they tell.
Yeah, I mean, typically, like you just pointed out, the highest people who come to this country and work, they pay taxes. They don't have Social Security numbers, so they use international tax ID numbers, but they pay their taxes for the most part. Their kids are raised. They're very low crime rate, extremely low crime rate among undocumented immigrants and among documented immigrants, far outshined by the crime rate of native-born Americans. And
or the president of the United States, by the way.
Well, most of us are. Yeah, right. But like take an issue, the way this is spun and the way that we know, fentanyl is a great example of this. The fentanyl problem in the United States, they'll mix the two, they conflate everything, the Republicans do. This is about, we've got to stop the illegal drug trade and all the immigrants bringing in illegal drug and all this kind of thing. Fentanyl, for the most part, is trafficked into the United States by American citizens, about 93%. And these are statistics from some very conservative outlets, Cato and places like that. The reason is this, because if a U.S. citizen, if a non-citizen is trafficking in drugs and they go through a port of entry, they're likely to find the drugs because they're going to get searched more. If a U.S. citizen goes through, it's less likely. So the drug cartels are using U.S. citizens. So it's a fantasy and it's a lie to say that it's all immigrants. Generally law-abiding and generally working really hard to build a life for themselves and their kids. Look, here's the thing. This country, I think what we can agree, is the greatest country. And it is an attraction. That's what happens when you live in a great country. People want to be here. What we need here is somebody to say, let's take this system and let's update it. Because this is just nuts, the way we're living here, back and forth with different administrations, and it gets more horrific each time. And this is the worst I've ever seen. This is the most draconian enforcement apparatus I've seen yet.
Well, and David, you and I spent a lot of time trying to modernize our broken immigration
Yeah.
system. The term, by the way, that we started using in 2005 to to fix our broken immigration system, I actually wrote that. And that was actually my phrase that got adopted by the whole
Oh,
immigration community, right? Because I was working with our friend Frank Sherry and others back in a better time when Republicans and Democrats worked together on these matters, right?
remember those times.
And yeah, I remember those times too. And so, David, I want to let you go because I know you've got a heart out. You're going to see David on CNN and on MSNBC. I'll be sharing his writings when he publishes. We're going to have him back because this is obviously an ongoing issue. I want to really try to work here with all of you to create a deeper understanding of how the immigration system works. There's a lot of confusion about this, a lot of hyperbole, a lot of disinformation. And finally, I want to just add that I wrote today, and we're doing this interview on Friday. I'm going to release it on Saturday. My post today on Hopium was about how Donald Trump has an agenda to raise prices on all everyday Americans. The tariffs are going to raise prices on everything for everybody, and this could start as early as 10 days from now. The tax plan the Republicans are playing around with right now would increase taxes on middle class people and cut taxes on wealthy people. It would eliminate benefits and drive up healthcare costs and other costs on middle class people. But the other way that they're going to dramatically potentially accelerate costs and raise costs is in shrinking the American workforce, which is going to force things like food and everyday items, even healthcare, to go up in price. These mass deportations increases inflation, increases prices for everyday people. And part of what I wrote about today, and I'll let you go, David, is that the we have to remember that if you're very wealthy, inflation being 3% versus 2%, it doesn't matter. Interest rates being 4.5% versus 6.5%, it doesn't matter. Your food prices going up a little bit, it doesn't matter. Healthcare costs going up, it doesn't matter. Childcare costs going up, it doesn't matter, right? Housing costs going up, it doesn't matter. You're insulated from the issues around price increases because of your wealth. You can absorb all this. So what we're seeing now is a legitimate and serious agenda for the broligarchs, right? Donald Trump has decided to do the bidding of the broligarchs, and he's throwing all the people, working everyday people in America, under the bus. And because he's got an agenda that will purposefully raise prices while cutting taxes in exchange for cutting taxes on wealthy people and for corporations. It's obscene. It's an incredible betrayal of everything that he ran on. And that what we have to recognize is the economic consequences. What David and I were describing is there could be a removal of 2 to 3 million workers in the United States soon. The labor market impact on that is going to be unbelievable all across the country. And then, by the way, the people who are going to be hurt the worst are going to be people in rural parts of the US that have the worst worker shortages. This mass deportation strategy is a catastrophe for red rural America. It is, and in ways that I think is going to become very evident very soon. And traditionally, the ag community was among our most important allies, David. And what you're going to see is if there are already unbelievable worker shortages throughout all of red state, rural America. All of that is going to be far worse very, very quickly. And so this is serious stuff. David, thank you for your incredible leadership over many decades now. And thank you for now being part of the Hopium family. We've been buddies for a long time, and I look forward to having you back as this thing evolves.
Well, thanks for diving into this issue, Simon. I can't imagine a more, important time, and your understanding of the issue is gonna help move this ball forward. So thank you.
No, I'm ready to dive back into this thing. You and I have been doing this a long time. Okay, brother. Good luck with everything. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.